For more than 30 years, the murder of an 11-year-old girl remained shrouded in silence. No suspects arrested, no clear answers, only questions that time seemed to bury deeper and deeper. In a small town defined by routine and quiet living, no one could have imagined that, on an ordinary afternoon in September 1988, such a dark story would begin to unfold. There were no screams, no clear witnesses who could explain what had happened. Only a sudden disappearance, followed by a discovery that would shock an entire community. For decades, investigators reviewed case files, analyzed forgotten leads, and followed trails that led nowhere. The case went cold. The headlines faded, and for many, it became just another unsolved mystery. But not everything was lost. Because even when time erases memories, it also preserves secrets. Years later, with advances in technology, something almost invisible would once again draw the attention of investigators. A tiny detail, left behind in the final moment of desperation by a victim who fought until her very last second. That small fragment carried a truth. A truth that had been hidden for decades. A truth that would finally point to a name. But when that name came to light, it brought more questions than answers. And it revealed something even more disturbing. Even after all this time, justice may not be enough. This is the story of a crime that time tried to hide, but never managed to erase completely. Her name was Melissa. Before any last name, before any story. She was simply Melissa, but to everyone who would come to know her later, she would become Missy. She was born in Massachusetts on March 1st, 1977, but her story began in silence and hardship. Still an infant, Melissa was left behind, rejected before she ever had the chance to understand what the world was, or what it meant to be loved. But just a few weeks later, everything changed. At only 1 month old, she was adopted by Janet and Robert Tremblay, a couple who chose to give her what she had been denied at the very beginning, a home, care, and a second chance. And it was there that Melissa gained more than a family. She gained a name. Melissa was no longer just Melissa. She became Melissa Ann Tremblay. And for a time, she had that. Growing up in Salem, New Hampshire, Missy became the center of that small universe. With no siblings, all the attention was focused on her, and perhaps because of her difficult beginning, there was something different about her. A quiet intensity, a deep need to belong, to be loved, to not be left behind again. She was charismatic, cheerful. She made friends easily. She trusted people with the kind of innocence only a child can have. But beneath that, there was a constant restlessness, as if something inside her was never completely at peace. Then, just a few years later, everything changed again. When Missy was only 9 years old, her adoptive parents separated. And once again, her life was broken. She went on to live only with her adoptive mother. The routine changed, stability disappeared, and the home that once meant safety slowly became something else. Over time, her mother entered a new relationship, and during this period, Missy began experiencing moments no one else could see, but that quietly shaped her childhood. She was often taken to a social club in another city, the city of Lawrence. While the adults talked, drank, and lived their own lives, Missy waited. Sometimes inside the car, sometimes outside, sometimes alone, wandering through the nearby streets. She spent her time staring into store windows, walking without direction, or trying to find other children to play with around the city. One of the places where she found the most company was also one of the most dangerous. The Boston and Maine Railroad, which ran through the city of Lawrence, was located near the club. There, children gathered among empty freight cars, watching trains pass by, turning that environment into something that felt almost normal, almost harmless. But it wasn't. The area was also frequented by drug users and people who used the rail cars as shelter, an environment far from safe for any child. That was how she filled the empty hours, waiting for someone to remember she was there. This routine repeated itself for years, and even so, she was still just a child. At 11 years old, Missy was no longer the same little girl, but she still dreamed. She liked music, fashion, and simple things that made up her world. She still smiled. She still trusted. Maybe a little too much. Because despite everything she'd already been through, she still believed that, deep down, the world was a safe place. And maybe that was exactly what put her in danger. because Missy was not just a victim. She was a child who had already been left behind once, and who, without knowing it, was about to be left behind again. This time, forever. And everything would change on Sunday, September 11th, 1988. An afternoon that seemed ordinary, with no sign that anything was about to go wrong. Missy was in a good mood that day, although as usual, she also showed her restless side. Early in the afternoon, she once again accompanied her mother to the social club in Lawrence, where she would meet her boyfriend, a place that had become part of Missy's routine over the past few years. While the adults talked and passed the time, Missy did what she always did. She moved around the place, observed her surroundings, interacted with people, and searched for something to keep herself occupied. At one point, still inside, she asked an attendant for some popcorn. It was a simple, everyday gesture, the kind of detail no one would think to remember later. A short time later, at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, Missy left the club. Before leaving, she told her mother she was going to meet some friends near the railroad tracks. She said she wouldn't be long. She promised she would be back soon. And then, she walked away. Outside, the world carried on as usual, people coming and going, the ordinary sounds of the city filling the air, nothing that suggested any immediate danger. Missy walked through the area, passing familiar places, trying to find other children to play with. At one point, she knocked on the door of a house where she had made friends the last time she had been in the city of Lawrence. But this time, they could not come out. She kept walking. Some witnesses would still see her after that. A railroad worker later reported seeing Missy near the tracks, warning her that it was not a safe place. According to him, she listened and walked away. For a moment, it seemed like everything would end there, but it didn't. Later, someone else saw her again. This time, she was not alone. Missy was seen talking to a man, standing beside an old van, light in color, worn down by time. Meanwhile, inside the club, time was passing. And little by little, something no longer felt right. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Missy's mother realized her daughter was no longer there. At first, it did not seem like a reason to panic. Missy had wandered off before, distracted, talking to other children or exploring the area, and that was something her mother considered normal. Still, there was a limit, and that limit was beginning to be crossed. Minutes turned into an hour, and the concern only grew stronger. Her mother began searching for her, first inside the club itself, asking employees, patrons, anyone who might have seen Missy. No one knew exactly where she was. Some said they had seen her earlier, but nothing more. That was when the search expanded. She and others began walking through the nearby streets, calling out the girl's name, checking every corner, every sidewalk, every place where a child might be. The area around the railroad tracks was also searched, but there was no sign of her. As the sun began to set, the unease gave way to real fear. Something was wrong. Missy would not stay gone that long without saying anything. Not like that. At around 9 o'clock that night, with no answers and desperation already setting in, a decision was made. The police were called. Within minutes, the situation was no longer just a family concern. It became an official search. Patrol cars began moving through the area, officers were mobilized, and the investigation started with urgency. But at that moment, no one knew exactly what they were looking for, because Missy had left behind no clear clues. No cry for help. No obvious trail. Only an absence, growing heavier by the hour. And as time passed, the feeling grew that something far worse had happened. September 11th, 1988, which had begun like any other day in the city of Lawrence, would end with the entire community in fear. The morning of September 12th arrived, and the search continued throughout the day, until it finally brought an answer. But it was not the answer anyone wanted to find. At approximately 3:45 in the afternoon, a railroad worker was carrying out his duties in a freight yard near the tracks, just 1 block from the club Missy had visited with her mother. It was a familiar place to him, part of his daily routine. Nothing suggested that moment would be any different until something caught his attention. Between the rail cars, there was a body. What he found was not only shocking, it was deeply disturbing. In a secluded area, just yards from where Missy had last been seen, the scene revealed clear signs of extreme violence. The body was partially off the tracks, but the left leg remained on the rail, severed near the hip, with clear indications that it had been struck by one of the passing rail cars. The surrounding environment told a silent story. Marks on the ground, disturbed soil, footprints, clear signs of a struggle. There was evidence that Missy had tried to resist, that she fought with everything she had. Her hands, marked with dirt and injuries, reinforced that desperate confrontation. This was not an accident. The police were called immediately. When investigators arrived, they quickly realized the body had been moved. Everything suggested that the attack had taken place nearby, and that someone had tried to hide what they had done, perhaps to confuse, perhaps to buy time, perhaps to cover the truth. But the truth was already exposed. The news spread quickly. The community, still holding on to hope that Missy would be found alive, was struck by a devastating reality. The disappearance had turned into something much bigger and far darker. From that moment on, it was no longer about finding a missing girl. It was a murder investigation. And in the midst of shock and grief, one question began to echo among everyone. Who could have done something like this? And how did they vanish without leaving answers? From the moment Missy's body was found, the investigation took on a new dimension. What had once been a concerning disappearance became a brutal homicide case, and every minute now mattered. The Lawrence Police Department quickly secured the area and began a detailed analysis of the crime scene. The signs were clear. There were marks of a struggle. Everything indicated that Missy had tried to escape, tried to resist until her very last moment. The autopsy, performed at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in Worcester on September 14th, revealed the extent of the violence. Missy had been beaten and stabbed, one wound to the liver, another to the chest, along with a deep cut to her throat just below the Adam's apple. She also had a fractured skull and severe bruising on her back. The cause of death was determined to be the stab wounds. Another detail made the scene even more disturbing. Missy was already dead when a freight train passed through the area, striking her left leg at the hip. The analysis of the injuries provided another clue. Investigators concluded that the attacker was likely left-handed and that the assault may have occurred from behind. Even so, there were clear signs of resistance. Beneath Missy's fingernails, fragments of skin and human tissue were found, evidence that she fought with everything she had. Today, that material could be decisive, but in 1988, forensic technology did not yet allow for that level of analysis. Even so, the evidence was preserved. For investigators, that meant one thing. The attacker had been very close to her, close enough to leave traces behind. Witnesses were interviewed. Some reported seeing Missy alone. Others provided a troubling detail. An unknown man with a disheveled appearance, seen nearby around the same time. He was reportedly standing beside an old, light-colored van, worn and rusted, a detail specific enough to catch the attention of police. From that point on, similar vehicles began to be tracked in the area. At the same time, known criminals, local residents, and individuals with violent histories were questioned. The pressure increased with each passing day. The community wanted answers. The family demanded justice. But there was one difficult obstacle. Despite the leads, nothing pointed to a definitive conclusion. The technology of the time limited the investigation. Evidence that today could solve the case, back then was almost useless. Everything depended on testimonies, assumptions, and connections that never fully came together. Some details still stood out, such as the possibility that the attacker was left-handed, but without a name, that was not enough. As time passed, the leads went cold, and the case was slowly pushed aside, leaving behind only questions and an unsettling silence. As the years went by, the intensity of the investigation began to fade. In the early days, there had been urgency. In the first months, there was still hope. But as new leads stopped emerging and every path led to the same place, nowhere, the case began to grow cold. Investigators continued revisiting details, reanalyzing statements, trying to find something that might have been overlooked. But each new attempt only reinforced the same reality. There was not enough evidence. There was no concrete suspect. There were no answers. Meanwhile, life around them moved on. The town, once gripped by fear and shock, slowly returned to its routine. Headlines disappeared, media attention faded, and Missy's case, once a top priority, became just another quiet file among so many unsolved crimes. But for Missy's mother, time did not move the same way. The days brought no relief. The years did not erase the pain. On the contrary, the absence grew heavier. Every memory, every date, every detail kept the same unanswered question alive. Who did this? Deep down, she also carried a silent burden, a sense of guilt. The feeling that she had not given all the attention, all the care that the child she once chose to raise deserved, and that she had always promised to give. Decades passed. Technology advanced. New techniques emerged. Cold cases across the country began to be reopened. Stories that once seemed forgotten resurfaced, proving that time does not always erase. Sometimes it simply waits. And in the middle of that quiet progress, Missy's case remained there. Filed away, but not closed. Because even without answers, there was something that never completely disappeared: evidence. Small, almost invisible. The material found beneath her fingernails, ignored for years, but still there, waiting for the right moment to finally reveal the truth. Decades passed, and with them, something began to change. What once seemed like a case destined to be forgotten began to draw attention again, not because of new witnesses or confessions, but because of something much smaller, something that had been there from the very beginning, but that, for years, could not be fully understood. Science had evolved, and with it, the way of looking at the past. In 2014, 26 years after Missy's murder, the case was decisively reopened. Investigators returned to one of the most important pieces of evidence: the material found beneath the girl's fingernails. With more advanced technology, they were able to identify a type of DNA, like a biological signature left behind by someone. This material became known as the fingernail profile. This type of DNA revealed something important. It came from a man, but it still was not detailed enough to identify exactly who it was. It was like having only part of a fingerprint, helpful, but not enough to solve the case on its own. At that point, there were no suspects and no matches in national databases. Once again, the investigation stalled. The following year, in 2015, Missy's mother passed away from natural causes, without ever seeing the person responsible for her daughter's death identified or brought to justice. In 2019, new analyses were conducted. This time, forensic experts found another DNA sample on an area of Missy's shirt, near one of the stab wounds. This new material became known as the shirt profile. But there was an unexpected detail. The two DNA samples did not match. That meant investigators now had two different leads, and possibly more than one person involved. Around that same time, a modern technique began transforming old investigations. Genetic genealogy. In simple terms, it allows investigators to use DNA to find relatives of a suspect, building a family tree until they reach the right individual. With that, in late 2019, investigators brought in a specialized company to assist. And that is when the first real breakthrough in decades emerged. The report, released on February 16, 2020, changed everything. After decades without answers, the investigation finally had a new direction. A last name began to surface from years of silence: McClendon. From that moment on, police began a quiet search. Anyone with that last name who had any connection to the city of Lawrence was examined, especially those with suspicious histories. Then, in June of 2020, something drew attention. A police officer traveled to the city of Athol to speak with a man, Timothy McClendon. A seemingly simple detail connected him to the past. He had received a speeding ticket in Lawrence in 1989. Decades earlier. When approached, Timothy refused to provide his DNA. But this time, the investigation would not stop there. With a court order in hand, he was compelled to comply. And months later, in October of 2020, the results finally came in, and what investigators saw changed the course of the case. Timothy's DNA matched the material found beneath Missy's fingernails. But there was a crucial detail. That did not necessarily mean he was the killer. It meant something even more unsettling. The person responsible was within the same family. Until that moment, the name McClendon had never appeared in the investigation. No connection, no suspicion, nothing. It was as if, for more than 30 years, they had been completely off the radar. Now, everything was changing. Investigators began building the family tree, name by name, connection by connection. And that is when another name emerged: Marvin McClendon, Timothy's older brother, also known as Skip. A new target, a new possibility. In March of 2021, investigators traveled to Alabama to speak with him. Unlike his brother, Marvin did not resist. He agreed to talk. He agreed to provide his DNA. But he denied everything. He said he had no involvement in Missy's death. And, unexpectedly, he pointed in the opposite direction. According to him, the name investigators might be looking for could be his own brother. Now, the investigation did not have just one name. It had two. But as the pieces began to fall into place, all the evidence started pointing in one direction. Marvin. At the time of the crime, in 1988, he was 41 years old. During that period, he lived just minutes from where Missy was murdered and worked as a carpenter, doing jobs for a church located just yards from where her body was found. Too close. There was another detail that stood out. Marvin owned a van at the time, a vehicle similar to the one described by witnesses on the day of the crime. For investigators, everything was beginning to converge in the same direction. But what made it even more disturbing was what he did beyond that. For years, Marvin had also worked as a correctional officer, a man who understood the system from the inside, who knew how investigations worked, who understood how criminals were identified, and perhaps how to avoid being caught. Nearly a year after the investigation intensified around him and his brother, the truth finally caught up with Marvin. On the afternoon of April 26, 2022, he was arrested at the age of 74 at his home in Alabama, charged with the murder of Melissa Tremblay. Even in the face of those charges, he denied everything. And yet, despite the arrest, the questions did not disappear. How did he cross paths with her? Was it planned? Or just a chance encounter? And the most unsettling question of all, were there other victims who were never discovered? Those questions were never answered. Not by Marvin and not by the police. And it was precisely that uncertainty that opened the door for the defense. The attorneys argued that the genetic evidence was not conclusive enough to identify, with absolute certainty, the person responsible for the crime. According to them, the DNA could belong to any other male within the same family. They also questioned the interpretation of older evidence, analyzed decades later using modern techniques. Marvin, in turn, cooperated with the investigation. He provided his DNA and, above all, firmly denied the accusations. And it was at that moment that doubt began to grow. In the first trial, the jury was unable to reach a decision. After hours of deliberation, the case ended without a verdict. A new trial was held. Once again, the evidence was presented, the arguments were repeated, and the same question remained at the center of it all: was it enough? After days of deliberation, the final answer came. The verdict was not guilty. And in a single moment, decades of investigation, hope, and expectation turned into something even harder to accept: uncertainty. The verdict brought an end to the trial, but not to the story. After more than 3 decades, the case that once seemed so close to an answer returned to the very place where it began: uncertainty. For the justice system, it was over. A decision had been made. The accused man was free. The case had come to an end. But for everyone else, nothing was finished. Missy's mother had passed away years earlier without ever seeing the person responsible for her daughter's death convicted, and those who grew up alongside her, her friends, continued to carry the same hope, to find out who did this. Because even after everything, the most important question still remains unanswered: who killed Missy? The truth, hidden for so long, surfaced only in fragments, incomplete, questioned, not enough to convince everyone. And maybe that is what makes this story even more disturbing. It is not just about a brutal crime. It is about time, about how it can hide, distort, and even weaken the chances of justice. Decades passed between the crime and the trial. Witnesses grew older. Memories became unreliable, and old evidence came to depend on modern interpretation. But in the middle of all of this, one thing never changed. Missy fought. She fought hard enough to leave behind a clue, a fragment of truth, something that endured through time and reached investigators. And even so, it was not enough. Today, the case may be closed in the courts, but it remains open in the minds of everyone who knows this story. Her family and friends believe in one truth. The justice system declared another. And between those two versions, there is a void that is difficult to fill. Because sometimes, even when the truth comes to light, it is not enough to bring peace. And so, Missy's case remains as a haunting reminder. Time may reveal secrets, but it does not always guarantee justice. And if this story kept you here until now, It is because, like so many others, you can feel that there are still answers hidden. Cases like this show that the truth is not always simple, and that some stories continue to echo, even after decades. If you want to follow more real stories like this, filled with mystery, details, and investigations that challenge time, make sure to subscribe to the channel now. Because here, no story is ever forgotten.